Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, RevOps, an Essential for Success, brought to you by Technology and Services Industry Association and sponsored by iasset. My name is Vanessa Lucero, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded. A link to the recording of today's presentation will be sent to you within 24 hours via email. Audio will be delivered via streaming. All attendees will be in a listen-only mode, and your webinar controls, including volume, are found in the toolbar at the bottom of the webinar player. We encourage your comments and questions. If you think of a question for the presenters at any point, please submit through the Ask a Question box on the top left corner of the webinar player, and we will open it up for a verbal Q&A at the end of today's presentation. Lastly, feel free to enlarge the slides to full screen at any time by selecting one of the full screen button options, which are located on the top right corner of the slide player. I would now like to introduce our presenters today. John Ragsdale, Distinguished Researcher and Vice President of Technology Ecosystems for TSIA, and Scott Frew, CEO of iasset. As with all of our TSIA webinars, we do have a lot of exciting content to cover in the next 45 minutes, so let's jump right in and get started. John, over to you.
Well, thank you, Vanessa. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're talking today about revenue operations, or RevOps, which in an annual recurring revenue world is an incredibly important topic. And we're going to be diving into exactly what it means, the technology infrastructure for successful RevOps, and a lot more. And I'm thrilled to have with me today a true expert on this topic. Scott Frew is the CEO of iasset. Scott, welcome back to another webinar.
Thanks, John. Great to be with you again.
Well, it's really good to see you. And could you kick us off with just a little bit about yourself and your company?
Sure. So my background is now over 40 years in channels, mostly building distribution organizations around the APAC region. And what we did was we tried to automate as much of the revenue operations processes inside our last business, and it got so successful that we had people knocking on the door asking to run the platform outside of Distribution Central. So we pushed it out as its own business back in 2018, and it's now running over $20 billion worth of products out there. It's driving revenue for all sorts of manufacturers, distributors, and resellers alike around the planet.
Well, fantastic. I'm thrilled to have you with us again. And let's dive in. So I'm going to open with my take on RevOps, and then you can tell me if you agree or what I'm missing out. But RevOps, or revenue operations, is a function that is combining sales, marketing, and customer success to optimize the revenue cycle, specifically in a subscription world. You know, it's not just a sales organization anymore. Everybody's got a role to play in annual recurring revenue. Some of the key initiatives from my perspective is really aligning the goals and objectives of sales, marketing, and success, unifying the data and applications across all departments, which is a pretty heavy lift for a lot of legacy companies, and creating a seamless customer experience. So as they are going through that customer journey, there is as little or no friction as possible. Scott, what do you think of my definition there? Anything I left out that's key?
No, I think that's reasonably accurate. I think where Rev Tech and RevOps sit is sort of this wedge between CRM, ERP, and ITSM type systems, or customer success type systems, and trying to actually bring all that siloed data back into one, and well, not necessarily one source of truth, but many sources of truth, because different platforms are operating at different parts of the business. So it's actually bringing it all together so that you can generate recurring revenue and expand campaigns off that data automatically.
Well, there are implications there on people, process, and technology. We're going to hit on all of those, especially the technology front today. But we're seeing the RevOps model gaining a lot of momentum in 2023. Why is RevOps now more important than ever? And what are some of the challenges you are seeing working with your clients?
Well, I think, look, really the way you look at it now is that people are starting to understand that without the appropriate data, clean data, you can't run a recurring revenue model over software or cloud consumption. It has to be very tightly orchestrated inside an organization. And a lot of companies are realizing you can't just throw people at it anymore. And if you really, truly want to run a customer success program or a partner success program, if you're dealing with a channel between you and the customer, you've really got to tightly integrate those data points in order to make that successful. And I think, you know, over time, a lot of organizations have been struggling and still continue to struggle with trying to get access to those silos of data. There's still some protection rackets running over each individual database inside organizations. But, you know, C-level executives are starting to see the opportunity and are starting to work with their teams to move those data into a seamless, connected state.
What are some of the typical challenges you see your clients dealing with as they're trying to realize this RevOps model?
Look, I think, as I alluded to data, I think there's a nature of, you know, we've built macros in our Excel spreadsheets, or we're trying to, you know, hammer our ERP to do what this does, or to a certain extent, there's also some apathy out there, especially if they're not necessarily in recurring revenue yet, even though they're being pushed in that direction. So they're the sort of internal challenges. You've also got, with the economic downturn and some people laying off, what I call organizational intelligence. That's also proving difficult, and we've seen some customers that need help, but they've lost a lot of the expertise that they formerly had.
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to think, especially legacy companies, that in the on-prem world, you just had to close a deal and realize the revenue, and whether they got any value out of it was really not your problem. I think those companies are probably the ones struggling the most moving to this, because they've got to worry so much more about renewals and expand selling. Do you see some like culture change required sometimes?
I do, and I think that's ongoing, John. I think if you look at especially the sales part of the organization, they're used to those big deals where they're getting remunerated on them, and we're now moving to sort of a drip feed type mode. And it may be that you have to completely replace that sales force, because it's a different, culturally, it's a different conversation with the customers. You've got to bring everyone along for the ride. It's not just the sales team winning a deal and then handing it off to the rest of the organization to actually fulfill. So there is a cultural aspect to that. And there's a lot of late adopters that are only just now starting to come to grips with even going through a subscription type model or a consumption model at that rate. So there's lots and lots of opportunity out there for customers to automate.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been talking about silos. Silos is a big topic at TSIA right now. Our upcoming event in Las Vegas next month is all about breaking down silos. Just one example of data, only 33% of companies are using any analytics to predict churn and retention, only 23% using analytics to identify really meaty expand selling opportunities. And in my mind, this is about really analyzing the entire customer journey, every touch point of the customer, and starting to do that correlation analysis to understand what are the positive and negative attributes that ultimately impact long-term revenue. And if your data is all stuck in a bunch of different silos, if you're not collecting similar information at each touch point to do that sort of analysis, it's probably never going to happen. So I'm curious how you would really define the RevOps model. And is it just about addressing data silos, or is that just a beginning point?
I think that's really just the start of this whole program, right? You've got to be able to start getting your data into a living state, I like to call it, rather than passive silos sitting around the organization, which tend to go out of date very quickly. is joining it into the entire business and getting the business to deal with the data on a daily basis or a monthly basis, whatever it is, through all of the organization rather than, sitting out in these silos. I think the predicting churn piece, TSIA's adoption part of the layer stack is critical. So you've got to understand, do I have dial home information that's sitting out in a silo so I can get the telemetry to join up with actually what's going out on the customers, so how much they're adopting, but also just understanding that they need to go earlier on renewals conversations than their competitors, because every renewal is now contested. It's not a fait accompli. And then your expand selling opportunities, if you don't get some sort of expand cadence going on, then renewals become a challenge, because if customers are left for 12 months before anyone gives them a phone call or engages with them, then there's a bigger risk to losing that customer.
Yeah. Who do you see driving these initiatives, particularly within large companies? A couple of years ago, it seemed that the CCO was kind of the most important person in a subscription business. And over the last year, I'm seeing the CRO is starting to take a lot more central role, because ultimately they're overseeing the revenue from land, expand, and renew.
Yep.
In the companies you're seeing doing this right, is this an IT play, a CRO play? Who's kind of driving the vision here?
So unsurprisingly, it depends on the organization. However, we have seen a trend where CEOs are getting involved in this process, because, the CRO might still be very much focused on the net new side of the business, and operations might be trying to deal with the back end. So there's definitely a trend for more engagement at CEO level, but I agree CROs are starting to pick that up, or being replaced with CROs that can handle subscription economics, because that's where the companies have got to move to. However, there are a number of very large US organizations that are still IT led. So IT will engage outside of the business, if you like, to start looking at these, because they realize many of them have tried to build their own systems for many, many years.
Yes.
And without going in the build versus buy argument, it really is not going to work, because the market's moving so fast. If you're not dedicated in that space, then it's very, very difficult to keep up or even be ahead of your competition.
Well, when you've been in this industry as long as both of us have, there's this constant shift between sort of the power of IT versus the power of the business user. And when cloud technology became so prevalent, it's like the business user got a lot more control, because they didn't have to go through IT to buy technology. And that was good, and it helped them speed some purchasing, but it also really compounded this silo problem. And with a lot of companies, trying to rationalize investments, it seems like IT is starting to get a little more control back in overseeing purchases to make sure that it is part of a larger vision, and that we're not creating more and more and more siloed data. Are you seeing IT stepping up to the plate more than maybe they have in a few years past?
The way I see it is, traditionally the business and IT have been at odds, because IT wants total control and business wants to go and sell more kit. So I would see IT's taking more control from a cybersecurity point of view. They want to make sure that they've got their arms wrapped around their data wherever it is around the planet. I still think there's this natural defense mechanism in the IT department, because SaaS companies such as ourselves are regarded as shadow IT, and they haven't got total control over us, so that you do suffer these sort of issues. But the business now is pushing forward and dragging IT behind it, rather than IT pushing the business forward and dragging the business behind it. So I've seen a definite shift, but there are still legacy companies out there that IT is driving the business rather than business driving the IT.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned earlier that you've had a lot of experience in channel business, resellers. What about RevOps, and what are some of the challenges, opportunities, impacts for RevOps with the channel ecosystem and partners?
So in the partner level or the reseller level of the channel, most of them don't have the capabilities to run customer success. They are quite reliant on the manufacturers doing that. And of course, if you're dealing with one of the global distributors, they may not have the capabilities to run customer success through. And, you know, historically, the distributors have been pretty straightforward as operational layer. They're not really adding value. Some have stepped out and they're doing great in the cloud business, but that's more about orchestration and trying to make a marketplace. But down at reseller land, they need the support of the manufacturer, or they need to invest in their own systems in order to plug directly into the manufacturers or the vendors' customer success dynamics. And you can't have customer success without partner success if you're dealing with a channel. Mm-hmm. And that really boils down to, are you a channel-led organization or you're an organization with a channel? And it's a completely different cycle.
We are seeing some survey data that companies that are doing a really good job of customer success, in particular, how to onboard, how to accelerate adoption, how to handle the renewals process. The companies that are doing that well are starting to extend more of that to their reseller partners, which is a good thing. But why wouldn't you? Ultimately, it's more revenue for you. Why do so many companies leave their resellers kind of floundering on their own?
I think there's a cultural aspect to that, John. So in North America in particular, where you've got the vendors are in country, they tend to rely less on the reseller or the partner network to do some of the work. I think where they fall over is the rest of the globe, which, you know, in a lot of cases, the reseller is acting as vendor in country for them and being that front end, but they're still looking at it with a North American kind of view. And I think as you see the more successful companies come out, they realize that every country's got different cultural aspects and different ways to engage. And you can see that the early adopters are already ahead of that curve. And then the ones in the hub are only really starting to come to grips with that right now. And I think, you know, you've seen like some of the some of the older manufacturers like Dell are going back to partner-led because they realize they can't leverage their own people to scale on a global business.
Yeah, absolutely. So they got to set them up for success.
Absolutely.
So when we start talking about a RevOps model, the first sort of questions that we often receive from members is around who owns the commercial activities. And I know it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but when we survey members about who has the primary responsibility for renewals, we see that about half have renewal specialists, and they may be reporting into success. They could be reporting into sales. Increasingly, I'm seeing more into sales. 26% of the time, the CSM owns the renewal. 27% of the time, the sales exec owns that. And when we look at comparing retention and expansion rates by these groups, they're not vastly different. We do see slightly higher retention rates when you've got a renewal specialist who's, you know, really an expert on that. Expansion rates vary a little. I'm not really surprised. Sales execs are a lot higher. They're professional salespeople. They're probably really good at that. I've got a couple of follow-up questions, but I first want to just get your take on this. I know there's not one answer for everyone, but what do you think is the best model to shoot for? Or if a client is asking you, where should this sit in my organization? What do you say?
So in short, I think if you look at those three individuals, renewal specialists tend to be operationally efficient and operationally focused. Customer success is more about adoption and staying engaged with the customer to make sure they're using the software or the platform, whatever it is. And the sales executive's there to close a deal. So how I see it and what we recommend is the renewal specialist part, automate pretty much the entire process that's going on with that, because a lot of it is just repetitive work. Wrap that into the customer success piece, retrain them to be that engaging sort of individual, and put the sales executive teamed with your customer success manager, because the sales executives are now concerned. I mean, as we always say, sales executives are coin operated. So you need to keep them engaged with the customer to make sure they're selling and expanding and moving forward. And the customer success manager can handle that more, are you using this new module? We've released some new software, how do we help you engage? But the CSM is going to be more focused on the customer winning whatever the customer's trying to achieve, whereas the sales executive is going to be focused on selling into the customer.
A good friend of mine is a CCO, and her success organization just inherited renewals and expand selling because their sales team wasn't doing a great job. And my concern is that a success manager really needs to understand the problems in the account. And are they really going to tell you the dirt about what's going on in an organization if you're going to use it against them and sell something to them? I see a CSM as the enabler for this, but I do worry if they are the one really holding the quota.
Well, I think you could still break that out into a salesperson and a customer success manager. And the salesperson should be in there trying to discover or dig up the challenges that the customer is having, whereas the CSM is more across the organization, making sure that we're delivering on those sort of outcomes for that particular customer. Because if you don't make the customer or put the customer in a winning situation, you'll never win. If it's all just selling into the customer, that's not a long-term strategy.
So for companies that are in the audience today and they're interested in this RevOps model, where do businesses start? How do they go about applying it to their business? Is it this slide? Is it figuring out who owns what? Is it a data problem? Where do you think companies should start if they want to move to this model?
My first go-to is always find the data. Find what data you have and where it's located. There's not a day that goes by that we're not on a phone call with a prospect talking about what customer data they have, what they're missing, and what we need to do to get them operational, at least at a very simple level. So data is the short answer on starting that. The next part is it's all about policy and process. Now, there's two types of customers. There's a customer that's going to engage and say, we've always done it this way. We want to continue to do it this way. They're never going to get ahead of the game. Then there's the customers that go to organizations such as ours and say, what's world's best practice and how do we apply that in the business that we're in today? And that's where you see these big wins happen with, renewal rates getting up in the 90s and expand rates. I mean, during COVID, the expand rates for some of our customers were as good as renewals because they couldn't get out and sell net new. So there's all sorts of opportunities. So data, process, and then your deployment.
So how big of a heavy lift is this for companies? If they've got a good CRO, if they've got a new revenue vision, is this something that you see companies easily able to execute, or is this a multi-year process?
Again, John, it depends on the company. We deployed a global within 30 days and we've deployed a global in 2 years. So it all depends on the organization and the motivation. So if you have C-level buy-in and they're driving this, you can get it done very, very quickly. If you've got, I think at a large organization level, you tend to hit what we call middle earth. So the executives might want it, but the middle part of the organization, middle management, are struggling with just performing day-to-day functions, let alone taking on a digital transformation type project. So you tend to get a lot of blocks in there. So that could slow you down. But if the organization's committed, and it's usually when there's new leadership have come in and said, we've got to move this organization forward, then you can do it very, very quickly.
Okay. So my final data slide is looking at the end-to-end customer experience. And this is from our customer success benchmark. Who was involved in the customer journey mapping exercise. More than half of companies have now completed one of those. And you can see not everyone is involved. So even looking at the customer journey, not everybody's got a seat at the table to understand how well that is going. But, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is part people, part process, part technology, and just the beginning is breaking down these silos so everyone can have an open discussion about what's working for the customer, what's not working for the customer. And we've done a lot of webinars. I recently did a tech summit just on the topic of customer journey and customer journey analysis. But on that technology side, you have mentioned RevTech a couple of times. Could you delve into that a little more deeper? Exactly what do you mean by RevTech and how does it help?
So to go back a few steps, when we first launched iasset out to the IT market, and I said 2008 and earlier, it was actually 2008, we didn't have a category. We have literally spent the last 15 years in an education process. And it's only recently in the last 12 months that RevTech has come out as the category that we sit in. RevTech is all about driving revenue out of the data sets that are inherently living inside these organizations and taking out the drudgery of finding the gold, if you like, that's sitting in the data and automatically driving that revenue through the business. And it can be completely automated, like you talk about fully automated renewals type cadences or fully automated campaigns. You know, we have the ability in our platform to analyze install-based data at midnight every night, looking for an instance or some sort of condition that's happened inside the install base to be able to trigger an event. Or end of life. I mean, end of life is a massive opportunity for a lot of organizations. And if you have a channel sitting between you and the end customer, a lot of end of life or end of support communications are not reaching the customer. It's getting sent to distribution. Distribution largely ignores it. The resellers don't know they're exposed, and then the end customer can often be in difficulty when they need support for something. So RevTech is really putting its arms around all of those silos that we've talked about, analysing what opportunities are out there and driving the business's revenue forward from the install base and the product lifecycle piece of the business.
So obviously CRM and ERP play a big piece of this. What are other systems that you commonly see that you need to pull data from or integrate with to really complete this picture?
So to that point, the most basic connection is ERP, because you need to be able to tell the ERP system to generate a sales order and a purchase order and such, and get that information back to us, because you want to track, serial numbers and start and end dates of contracts, or if you're co-terming or whatever. Then the next step is, if you are running a CRM, you hook into the CRM to deliver opportunity information, usually for reporting inside organizations. But if you're in a distribution stack and you're not actually prospecting for new customers, you don't necessarily need the CRM piece. Then we would communicate to an ITSM or a support desk like ServiceNow, one of those type products. And that's to tell them what the entitlement records are that are sitting out in your customers. And again, we'd get reports back if something changed. Then dial home, which I alluded to earlier. One of the biggest opportunities out there in the field is many organizations have telemetry coming back from products in the field, but they're not connected to their channel, or they don't have the dots joined to be able to make that proactive. And they're doing it to make sure the products stay live, which is great. But actually, what if you're a storage company and the telemetry is telling you that they know the customer's going to run out of storage in 3 months' time? Wouldn't it be awesome just to send an engineer from your reseller, wherever they are, out with another shelf to put on the storage array, as an example? There's all sorts of triggers that you could delve into, but it's, again, keeping your channel aligned with the business out there to make sure that your product is successful inside the customer. So they're the most basic systems. Then you might join in your partners. So if you're a vendor and you've got partners below you, you might put out APIs for them to connect their systems, or if they're running our system in there. So you really start to build this network effect amongst your entire organization and that ecosystem that sits within the context of your trading partners. So you can talk to pretty much everything, but again, bringing it back and communicating between all the different platforms that you have will keep your source of truth, not necessarily one source of truth, but sources of truth everywhere inside the organization completely aligned.
So there's a huge interest at the moment in AI and generative AI. What role does AI play in the RevTech, and any interesting things on the horizon you see with maybe leveraging Gen AI?
Look, specifically in generative AI, we've got some very early sort of tech going on, which I won't comment now. But on AI and machine learning, we have had for some years now a module called Ingrid, because every AI needs a name. And Ingrid was built to predict renewal close rates the quarter ahead of your current quarter. So the idea being, it would alert based on parameters such as how successful is the reseller, the region, the product type. All this information would balance out to tell you if there's risk inside a renewals cadence a quarter ahead. So you need roughly 3 years of operational intelligence inside one of our platforms to get to that nirvana. But it certainly saves people sort of getting into their current quarter and realizing the deal's gone south already, where they could have actually been alerted to it, up to 6 months out.
Yeah, I think today success teams at least are putting so much emphasis on this health score. And when we start digging into their health scores, it's based on a lot of subjective data and not a good balance of qualitative, quantitative, and not deep analysis as you just described. So, I've got to think to scale these teams, we've got to have better understanding of churn propensity, so you know where to focus your limited resources on the accounts that it could make a difference.
Well, and there's an opportunity there, right, John? Because you could overlay the operational analysis that we're doing with the customer scorecards, which might be a bit more subjective, to actually get an even rounder view of each customer and where threats might lie.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been talking a lot about potential. You've made allusions to some of your customers, but could you give us an example of how this is working well for one of your accounts?
Sure. So one of the largest security companies run the platform. So their challenge was they need to send a piece of hardware out to the customer, because that's where it runs the consumption software on. They needed something to really track not only the asset sitting out there in the field and the serial number and all the rest of it, but they needed the consumption piece on top. So in their world, we talk to a license management system. We track all of the resellers related to that particular end user. And up until we'd walked in the door, they had not really had a way to do that without lots and lots of Excel spreadsheets. So it's now completely automated. It's completely aligned with the channel. They know where they're at with their consumption below and their customers. At a distribution stack, when one of our distributors first turned on the platform, it exposed over $100 million worth of opportunities they'd never seen before, just because their siloed data was all over the place. And the experience in distribution, it's only because I'm a distribution guy, is when we turn the platform on, it will start loading opportunities, often more than the distributor can cope with. So it takes a while to get over the hump and get into the automated mode. And then down in the resellers struggling. We've got a number of Cisco resellers on the West Coast in particular that have taken the step to really take control of their own installed base data and to help with their CX compliance inside Cisco. And that has changed the game for them. They've got their arms around their install base. Their renewals are up in the 90s. So they're very, very happy with that. And they've redeployed. If we talk about people, I've got one organization that's completely eliminated sales order entry team because the platform's talking straight to ERP. Another organization that's doing antivirus type work and at a distribution layer, and they claim for just one vendor it saves them 8 people being fully employed just through the automation piece. So there's a lot of different aspects to this. We're also in intelligent mining devices because they didn't know where all the devices were. And finally, you've got IoT now is becoming a bigger issue because certain countries like the UK or even California as a state have been legislating that IoT devices must be updated with security patches, but most importantly, if you're not going to update them, then they must be communicated to the end customer to tell them they're not getting security updates anymore. So that's a very, very a potential compliance issue for a lot of large IoT manufacturers.
Wow. Yeah, I can't imagine. Well, I know we've got a lot of questions from the audience. Before I turn it over to Vanessa for audience Q&A, any final thoughts from you?
Look, I think the largest part of the business that you can get early runs on the board with is the expand piece. I mean, a lot of people don't really run expand campaigns. So if you can get your arms around the siloed data, put them into a platform such as ours, you'd be surprised how much revenue you could generate very, very quickly from a standing start. And in this current economic climate and with China sort of going south at the moment, lots of people are looking for places that they can drag quick revenue through the door.
Yeah.
But that's where I'd look, if I was a customer.
Well, Scott, I appreciate you being patient with all of my questions. And now we've got a lot of questions from a pretty large audience. So Vanessa, let me turn it over to you for Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks so much, John. And thank you, Scott. I think both of you for the conversation. And just as a reminder, if anybody would like to submit a question, please enter it in the Ask a Question box. And we're going to get through as many questions as time allows. With that, I'm going to kick it off with a question from Terrence, and they're asking, what are some of the main KPIs and metrics we should be using to measure RevOps success?
So from my point of view, there's some very basic ones like renewal rates, or another way to look at it is maintenance attach rates or consumption churn. There's a whole bunch of them that you could run. But the biggest ones are, to me, your adoption metrics, because, again, to my point earlier, if you don't have people adopting your technology, then the rest of the metrics are going to be out anyway. So I'd be focused on that. And that way you can take them through to renewals because they're using the product. So very much focused on that adoption piece. Okay,
we have Jason next. And they're asking, do you have any advice on how to keep the momentum going and avoiding a multi-year project that blows just completely out of control?
I presume Vanessa is talking about us deploying inside a business. The short answer is, as long as you've got commitment, which I alluded to earlier, at a C level who's driving the project forward, and you're not getting stalled internally with politics and all the rest of it, that'd be my advice, getting executive oversight very, very quickly. Once you get a platform in, we always like to say 12 months and a day, it will start to fly, because you're going to go through a cleansing process for that first 12 months as you ingest those data elements. But 12 months and a day, your automation starts, and that will propel you forward whether you like it or not.
Okay, our next question is from Chelsea, and they ask, you mentioned RevTech. How is it different from using a CRM or an ERP?
Sure. So RevTech sits kind of between CRM and ERP. If you think for a moment that ERP is really to manage the financial aspects of the system, directly reporting into the CFO for all of their financial aspects, sales order processing, purchase order processing, stock if you're a physical manufacturer or one of the channel partners. CRM is really more about the prospecting piece, although both of them have tried to make moves out of their core market. RevTech is actually driving revenue out of the data that you are carrying inside your business. So, the easiest one is just getting quotes out the door. I'm a Ray Kroc fan, and you've buried your money in selling them a burger. You want to make sure they buy the fries, the Coke, and the apple pie at the same time. So at a net new level or an expand level, you want those sort of opportunities being driven. And renewals. Renewals has been around for 1,000 years, but everyone was thinking about originally sending out notifications to say you need to renew your product. Now we send out completely automated transactional quotes that can be acted on by the customer, if you like, and the money taken straight there out of that email rather than sort of just reminders and then re-engaging with your channel or further up the stack. So it sits very tightly between those sort of systems.
Okay. Our next question here is actually for you, John, and they're saying, Paul asks, what are the main roadblocks you see when it comes to moving this sort of model?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier, I seem to see a lot of cultural issues, especially with legacy companies. Scott mentioned sometimes you need a new sales team, and some of those legacy account executives have way too much control. And they've been far too, incented on that land. And in an ARR world, the renew and expand is increasingly important. But I do see this continuation of departments buying point solutions that they can, get for $10 a month per user or something. And so we're just proliferating these silos, and nobody's got that overall view. And I do think that we need to invest in something like a customer experience ops group, somebody that's got a view of all of the data across the entire customer life cycle. Where is it stored? How is it stored? What are we collecting, like satisfaction data, effort data, NPS data, to make sure we're collecting that intelligently and consistently so we can really do comparisons across it. So it truly is people, process, and technology. But I think if we can break down the cultural silos and get these groups working together, we will be able to solve these data problems a lot easier. Does that make sense, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, your people and process are the start of everything. If you don't have great people working for you, you're never going to move ahead anyway. Process is develop your policies and the rules that you need to be able to tell platforms such as ours so that it can automate your life. And, you really, from an entrepreneur's point of view who's built a number of successful companies, you don't want your people doing the boring minutiae every day. You'd like them to be released so they can engage properly with customers to give you a better customer satisfaction rather than to be buried in Excel spreadsheets or quotes or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we do have quite a few questions we weren't able to answer here live, but don't worry, we haven't forgotten about you, and we will make sure to follow up. And with that, since we have come to the conclusion of today's webinar, Scott, are there any final remarks you'd like to leave the audience with today?
Look, obviously I'm out there selling the whole RevTech model, but I'm trying to inspire people through LinkedIn and various other mechanisms to actually start thinking outside the box. We are all terribly, terribly busy, especially since COVID, and work-life balance has been shot. I'm trying to get people to be inspired to take the drudgery out of the organisation, and there's not many businesses that can do that. And as you know, ERPs are very heavyweight, and these days, no one gets fired for buying Salesforce.com and all that sort of stuff. I'm trying to inspire people to think a little bit differently about how their business operates and what they can do to make their customer journey, and more importantly, because I'm a channel guy, their channel partners fully engaged and happy. So that's kind of where I'd be looking at.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, since we have come to the conclusion of today's webinar, just a few quick reminders before we sign off for today. There will be an exit survey, and if you could please take a few minutes to provide your feedback on the content and your experience by filling out that brief survey. And know that a link to the recorded version of today's webinar will be sent out within the next 24 hours. I'd now like to take this time to thank our presenters, John and Scott, for delivering an outstanding session. And thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar, RevOps, an essential for success, brought to you by Technology and Services Industry Association and sponsored by iasset. We look forward to seeing you at our next TSIA webinar. Take care, everyone.